One second. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first and the initial webinar for the Black Studies Center at the University of Wyoming. This is for our Black History Month celebration. And before we get into the actual programming and introducing of those scholars who are with us now, got a few things that I gotta clean up. So as we begin today, we understand that Black History Month is very important. And for those of us who are not necessarily attuned to its importance, we'll get to that today. But a couple things we have to get to right now. What happens when we look at Black History Month through the lens of the Negro question? And that's how we're looking at it. So for all you good people, begin to take your notes. Before we move any further, everybody say hello to the African-American Intro to African-American Studies course here at
all right. How y'all doing? Good.
Here.
Good.
We got a full house and we are off and running. So to think about it through the lens of the Negro question in itself reads, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? Now that in itself is a very fluid, very valuable, and ultimately it leads to what we know now as race relations in America. When we look at that question, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? That comes from the first Mohawk Conference of 1890. And when we begin to discuss that, we become a bit more attuned as a people. And we have to understand that Wyoming is a very monolithic state in its makeup, in its composition. So for many of you all, this is definitely an introduction. And for some other parts or some other portions of the people who are with us today, it's a reintroduction. But I want to explain how that means what we need to talk about today in real time. What should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation as we tie it into this overview of Black History Month. Now, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation on this campus? What happens to the Black Studies Center consistently is not just a unified, ubiquitous, agreed upon marginalization of content that we put forth. That content is then used as if it's efforts created by the institution and other entities to lead diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. We understand already that whatever we do, particularly the lens that we look through, it is leading diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives on this campus and around the country. So we're talking about Black studies in rural areas, and that's where we're at right now. So to show you the disrespect that consistently comes towards the Black Studies Center about having these events, about talking about these paradigms, and then the usage of our brilliance and our intellectual fortitude and the way that we pull these things together, hard work, creativity, vision. So if you could put that particular picture up, Toby, we can use that picture right now. So I'd have everybody look. The last time we came out, young man from Florida, Dr. Stevenson, he had a piece called The Negro Question and Racism as a Public Health Crisis. As you see, October 28th is when we first pulled our poster, our promotional poster that's created by Toby Thompson, and very hard work that he put into it. And then somewhat simultaneously, but almost in a magical sense, this same reference to this same event was put on the university's main Facebook page on the 11th of November. But the one thing you see that's erased from this is the Black Studies Center. So I want to deal with this directly. And what I mean by that is I work in an industry that is very critical of the word plagiarism. Like you can lose your job. Like for me, if there was a way that you would be able to say that what we're going to do tonight was taken from somewhere else and we didn't give it its proper acknowledgement, then you would be able to say that would be plagiarism. This is the institution. The University of Wyoming's main Facebook page chose to take our event, remove who created the event, and say it was part of a University of Wyoming lecture series. That's incorrect. Now, someone would say, well, why would you mention that? Because we're at the point in history where enough is not just enough, but we want to show you, and particularly you all, students, the techniques and strategies that are used to marginalize these ideas, these paradigms, these researchers, their thoughts on a regular basis. Now, this is proof, what we call that empirical evidence that the university lifted our event. Now, it's not going to be problematic that they lifted event. You know, the problematic part will be that I mentioned it. So it's indeed hypocritical. It's indeed leading into plagiarism. Now, I had a young man who I consider an ally. Now, you know, that's a very tricky term. But the young man said, well, this is the person who did it. It's not my job to call the University of Wyoming's anything, particularly the person who controls the Facebook page, and say, don't do that. That's not my job. My job is to create the event, to have the conversation, to move the needle intellectually forward. But what came of this? Not even an apology. And that's why I started off this way. Because when we talk about what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation, they just exploited our event, took the event, didn't give it its proper acknowledgement, and then direct in specific ways, that's plagiarism. So that's how we're going to start. You can cancel that, Tobin. Thank you. So this is what we're up against to have these conversations. I looked at our Facebook page today. We had a picture up with Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Most of you have used that link. And it said something about reframing Black History Month. A white man, unapologetic, jumped on. He said, no, I prefer to use white history. I have no response for him. But these are the people, and many of you all who understand what I'm saying, particularly you all with positions of power who are white. Here's the idea. You know why your friends, your cousins, your relatives, your pastor say these things, because you have a collective identity. But you have to understand, other than you, there are collective identities that guide the actions, attitudes, and behaviors of other populations. So now to tie into today, the Negro question and Black History Month, I brought two very important people to me. I want to start, and we should, with Starlette Thomas. She, amongst many things, she's a master of divinity. She's going to tell this particular piece with a more religious sense. And I'm sure that you will love her conversation and the way she'll add to the mainstream narrative. And that's what we're going to do today. And then my dear brother, Dr. Jeffrey Lee, out of the Philadelphia area, my good brother. Scholarship amongst scholarship, and you see Dr. Starr with us amongst scholarship. So we do reach the baseline and far above that of what you call scholarly endeavors. Obviously, we have reached the baseline November 15th that you took the event, put it on your Facebook page and said it was yours. Imagine that. Imagine if I were to do that. Well, I got an email today from some office on the campus that said I had gone a little too far. I'm saying if I had done that. So we're looking at a hypocrisy. So as we begin today, when we think about the legacy of Black History Month, then we need to honor Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And when we think about honoring Dr. Carter G. Woodson, one thing becomes very important is that we understand that Dr. Carter G. Woodson in himself, born 1875 to slave parents, the very first Black to graduate, the second Black to graduate Harvard University with a PhD, but the first to graduate Harvard with a PhD as a historian. So he creates the Journal of Negro History, a Sala, and Negro History Week, as you know it, February 26th. Doesn't turn into Black History Month until 1976. So between 1926 and 1976, which is 50 years, you still called us Negroes as the world turns. So what he wanted to do in February of 1926 was to inject the accurate accomplishments of Blacks into the history of America. Please write that down, good people. The goal was to inject the accurate accomplishments of Blacks into the history of America. And then we have those myths that say, well, you know, Black History Month is February. They gave us the shortest month. No, Dr. Carter G. Woodson had an infinity for Abraham Lincoln and Fredrick Douglass, who are both known to be born in February. Now, Fredrick Douglass would have never known when he was born as a slave. One thing a slave was to never know when they were born. But he's given the date February 14th, 1818. Why? Because his grandmother said that was her sweetheart. And that ties into Valentine's Day. So as we move forward, let us begin the conversation. Sister Starlette Thomas, when you think about the history of Black History Month, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and then we add into this equation the Negro question. Can you please give us your thoughts? And we are so thankful to have you.
Well, thank you for the invitation. For me, the racialization of the human body is always problematic for me. So I have issues with the question itself, that the language does not come from the African-American community, that it misidentifies. Negro is not a term that Africans came up with, and neither is Black. As you know, race is a socio-political construct. There are no biological, and since you've mentioned my Master of Divinity, there's no biblical basis for race. I think the question is not our own. What should we do with the troublesome Negro? Like, I am not a problem. I am not trouble. And then it's trouble for whom? So I think oftentimes it's important for African-American people, because Black is a color, not a country, not a continent. We come from Africa. So I think it's first important that we remember our name and who we come from, and to find those people and to tell those stories. We need to remember that that's not our question, that we have never questioned our identity. And so answering a question that we don't ask of ourselves makes the conversation problematic for me. It's not my question. And I've never questioned my identity, except when you enter into this socio-political construct. I think the house of the oppressor is what James Baldwin calls it. So I think it's important for African-American people to begin to ask their own questions and to call themselves by the names that they feel most comfortable with. The fact that they came as African and ended up being Black and Negro and those are not our words. This is not our question. And so we need to, and Rosa Parks, she says you can't study a problem forever. When you see something that's wrong, at some point you have to do something about it. What are you going to do about it? Because this question is not our question. And we need to start asking questions that we really want answers to. That's their question. I'm nobody's trouble. That's not how God created me. That's not how I enter into the space. That's not how I enter into the world. That's a racialized narrative. And so for me, we need to start with the question itself. We need to address the question and who asked it and unpack that and then give it back to them, because it's not our own. I'm nobody's Negro. I don't answer to that name. I need to find the name that is my own and then answer to that, and then answer the questions that arise from my natural human being, not this racialized narrative.
Well, somewhere along the line, Sister Starlette, they got the name right, because when they say star, I do believe it. But before we move on to Dr. Jeffrey Lee, we want to ask everybody to join us right now. And Toby's going to put up questions that will guide this particular thing. And please answer the poll questions, please. Everyone, please answer the poll questions. Okay. I think we got almost 90+% participation. Please wrap that up, and we're going to move forward, and we're going to move on to our brother, Dr. Jeffrey Lee. Thank you all for your participation. And I want to encourage you all to please use the chat for your questions, your comments, your concerns. Please use the chat and become part of the conversation. So I'm ready to move on with my dear brother, Dr. Jeffrey Lee. When we think about the Negro question and we tie it to what we know as today, Black History Month, when we have these two entities, Dr. Starr has put us in a real good position to have this conversation about the Negro question, and asking you at this point your thoughts.
Well, when we think about this, and when I first saw the title and the focus of this talk tonight, it made me go back and revisit the Mohawk Conference. Of course, I studied that early on, and I knew that, dear brother, you brought this up for a very important reason. And to think about our great ancestor, Carter G. Woodson, and how his importance of African-American history juxtaposition with this conference, where these individuals had no knowledge of African-American history, or African history as a whole. All they thought of us as was individuals that they can use and abuse and do their work. One of these gentlemen at this conference made comments that all, as they say, Negro was good for was labor. They said that it had been 300 years since the date that they acknowledged that we were brought here, which we brought here longer than they acknowledged. But anyway, he stated that the African has lived in America for over 300 years and was saved from savagery, debauchery, and social decline. So clearly they had no knowledge or information about the history of the continent that they went and stole us from. And so we think about all the things that Dr. Woodson wanted this week to be, and we also understand that he really wanted this week to be a culmination of reading and studying and activity and all year long. And then this week was supposed to be a celebratory week. But that question, unfortunately, still lingers within this nation today in some people's eyes. As you yourself has told us earlier, how individuals still feel that it's okay to steal our intellectual property. And by the way, brother, when you showed that Facebook post from the university, I also noticed that they did not even have the courtesy to give the good brother, Dr. Stevens, his title. On that Facebook post, it simply said Rick Stevens. So here we are again in 2021, when that took place, still using and abusing us for their privileges and likings. So this question and this conference that or talk that you put together tonight really, I believe, should help us focus on how do we, as a people, move forward Dr. Woodson's thoughts, alleviate ourselves, as Dr. Starr just said a moment ago, of this question, because as she said, this is not ours. We should not own this, because people have been telling us for hundreds of years what we should own, what we should do, what we should like. And it's time for us to lay that burden down. We should not be labeled with that or be labored with that, and move forward and try to put something forth that Dr. Woodson, our ancestor, will be proud of.
If I might.
Go right in. Please feel free.
I think for me, the question continues, and I think that's where the rub is for me. It continues to center the socially colored white person and their perspective and their gaze. And it centers their false narrative, as Dr. Lee has already mentioned. African people, their history did not begin in America, but when you start calling people Black, so that you can commodify their bodies and put a price on their bodies and tuck meaning, tuck worth under skin and create a whole color-coded caste system, well, then that changes everything. So for me, we have to reframe the narrative and we have to start pushing back on the questions and simply tell people, that's not my question. And it's not a question for me. You have to start asking people, why is that a question for you? Why do you feel the need to exploit bodies? Why are you capitalizing on a body? Why does that remain the center of the controlling narrative in America? Why do you continue to see bodies as commodity? There are questions that we need to be asking of persons who seek to oppress and to keep other people down. So I think we should push back on those questions and offer questions of our own that don't question our identity, our ability to be mobile, to be thoughtful, to be historical, like we exist outside of this space and time. We need to push back on questions that center us in a space called slavery, when we have history before and after that. We have bigger and better than that. And so we have to push them along as well, because some of these questions, they maintain a plantation patriarchy and identity. In this, if I'm Black, if I can only be Black, and you can only be white, those are oppressor and oppressor identities. Those are false binary identities. There's only massa and overseer and slave with those identities when you come out of five. When if you say someone is Yoruba, oh, wait, what? As opposed to saying Black. You know, if you say, oh, I'm Nigerian, wait, what? What is that? You have to start pulling back, taking back, and claiming space somewhere else. But Black and white, these color-coded identities are made in America only. They have no history. The white identity, according to Winthrop Jordan, he said persons didn't start calling themselves white until 1680. They made it up. And we need to unmake it. And we need to unmask it. And I think it's very important for us to ask questions, to question race and the validity of it. We all know that it's a socio-political construct, that is a product of European Enlightenment, that was constructed for white supremacy, that persons came over and went from Irish, Polish, and German to white for privilege. We need to name that and no longer play this game. And it starts with questioning some of these questions.
All right, agreed. And as we begin to take this topic and narrow it down, we're at a position right now, Dr. Lee, in this discussion to talk about the importance of Black History Month and go into it through that particular lens. Now, going back to what Dr. Carter G. Woodson aspired to, it was to inject the accurate accomplishments of Blacks into the historical narrative. Now, I would like for you to take that thought, the accurate accomplishments, and then think about the written and dominant narrative of America and give us your thoughts on what I see to be opposing views.
Well, what we really need to really first look at is the American educational system. The American educational system is set up by the dominant culture. And it is set up that way to keep other groups of people in a submissive position. And so when Dr. Carter G. Woodson started this, he gave pamphlets, literature to several schools in various states, Delaware, North Carolina, West Virginia, City of Baltimore, Washington, D.C., local churches, and all organizations that were willing to receive this information and then disseminate it to students in American schools. So, of course, he received a lot of pushback. There were people who did not want to give this information or teach this information to their students. And so that did not deter him. He made sure that those who were willing to accept this information, teach this information, receive what they needed. Now, when we talk about education today, and we look at history books of today, not much of this false whitewashed narrative has changed. Now, we do have some states who in the late 2000s began to mandate African-American history as a mandated course. But the problem with that is those textbooks are still written by the white supremacist dominant group called the American publishing industry. And so you had such states as Arkansas, New Jersey, New York, and various other places institute regulations that made African-American history a required course. But oddly enough, 2 years ago in 2020, some of those same states began to attack and outlaw these same courses because they were afraid of critical race theory. So on one hand, you had, yes, we must have these courses taught in our schools. And ironically, 3 years later, no, we can't have this information taught because it's teaching the things that Dr. Carter Woodson actually wanted people to learn about African Americans and African American history. The great minds that helped lead African Americans, the genius businessmen who helped create industry in this country. So when we live under a rule of law and people can go into state legislatures and outlaw the learning of the true knowledge, we are really in a bad situation. But we as individuals and people who work in education, the only way to see through Dr. Woodson's, I want to say benevolent thought is that we got to push back. And I'm going to tell you now, as a K-12 educator, I have not seen not one parent show up at any of these school board meetings supporting critical race theory or the teaching of true African-American history to any students. And that's a problem, because the longer we remain submissive, the more they will push this agenda to whitewash history, and not just American history, but history in general. And the goal of Dr. Woodson will be lost forever.
Excellently put. Now, Dr. Starr, let's go to the idea of this power dynamic that Dr. Lee just mentioned in history. We are taught that history is the best of knowledge when it is tied to veracity. So I have a group here, Introduction to African American History, AAST 2360. So it's not an intro class, which means they have to have some class before that. And this is our first class. And we had a young man who just came and gave us what we call non-normative scholarly excellence. So that's where we're aiming. But the idea of how we look at history, particularly as Dr. Lee put it so eloquently, the fight that we have about the accuracy of history. Dr. Starr, what are your thoughts on that as it ties to the Black History legacy, or the Black History Month legacy by Dr. Carter G. Woodson?
Such a good question. I can't but help but emphasize the importance of storytelling in the griot. And I hope that our community returns to that and telling that story. I love the fact that Dr. Lee has behind him Sankofa, go back and get it. It is so important for us to recognize those images and to tell those stories as often and as possible as we can. But I'm reminded of the words of Chinua Achebe. He says there's this great proverb. He says that until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And it made me think about the statues that persons are fighting for that glorify the Confederate soldiers. They have a story that they want to tell. And if you don't tell it this way, then they don't want to hear it. We're all aware of all that. These are not new tactics. So we need to own that. But also we need to really invest in learning about race and the history of race in this country. That the minoritization of people groups was made legal. That socially colored white people are the majority because the American government made laws to keep it so. That kept Mexican people out, that kept Asian people out. This is not a flight of fancy. This is something that was intentional. This is not something that, oh, and they're just supreme. No, this is what socially colored white privilege looks like. Persons get together and they decide we're going to keep these people out and we're going to bring these people in for the purpose of securing resources. And so we have to tell the story accurately, and that takes time, that takes energy, that takes commitment and investment. You have to trace down and pinpoint every single lie. And that's why you need people like Dr. Lee in the classroom to say, ha, that's not how the story goes. Like, don't even mention anything about CRT. You really don't want me to tell you the truth about slavery. You don't want me to find out about what your, who your grandmother beat up or spit on. You don't want us to see those pictures of her. Just tell the truth and shame the devil. It also allows us, I think, with African American History Month, to combat images of African people and later African American people as lazy, which is gaslighting, as lazy or dangerous, or the mammy figure, right? Or the step and fetch it, or the really ignorant person. This is why we need to tell these stories, because if we don't, then persons, often in America, will revert to these stereotypes, right? That's why we need to say that African Americans are inventors and business persons and educators and civil rights leaders and lawyers and doctors and inventors. Because if we don't tell the story, then they'll tell a story that erases all of these accomplishments and calls us something other than our name.
Well, I think that we can move right along and look at it in a way that ties Dr. Carter G. Woodson's historical trajectory to something very contemporary. Dr. Lee mentioned it earlier, critical race theory. Dr. Starr just mentioned the idea of what it does and how paranoid people become of it. So what do we look to as people who are sitting in positions? And I mean, I look at it this way. This is very critical, but the failure of the Negro intellectual. When I look at many of us who are now at the top of our fields, when I look at many of us when we think about this expanding rate of Black PhDs, like, how do we tie it into Dr. Carter G. Woodson's thought about Black history? And then, as we say, what's at stake? Dr. Lee?
Well, first of all, what we all really must know and acknowledge is that just because you are African American doesn't mean you yourself know your history. So we have to take a mantle upon ourselves to learn our history. Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1926, as he tried to plan this, he said, he made this quote, he stated, "The Negro practically knows nothing of his history. His friends are not permitting him to learn it. The Negro, therefore, is referred to as a childlike race," because it was Dr. Carter G. Woodson's belief that unless you know who you are, it stunts your growth as a human being. When you really think about it, and I sit sometimes in my classroom and I hear my students tell me that their great grandmother came from England and their grandfather before that, they know who they are and where they come from, and that of it itself gives them a power that none of my students that look like me have, because many of our students don't know anything about their history. They have not been taught anything about their history in the schools that they dwell in, and their parents before that and before that were just the same. So we as a people must first take it upon ourselves to know our history. Now, nobody is expecting everybody to be a scholar, but you need to pick up a book, maybe watch some documentaries so that you have a background, and even maybe do, some of these ancestry tests to see where it is you come from, so that you then can pinpoint and gain knowledge and information. And only then can we proceed, because if everybody's not on the same page, we won't succeed. And that's part of the problem that's been hindering us as a people for generations. And when you talk about all the exalted scholars who have high positions at colleges and universities across this nation, many of them have no desire to put forth the effort to learn who they are, because they, in their mind, have ascended. And a lot of times they don't feel that they need to dwell with the common people, if you will. And I believe, brother, that's where you were leading when you stated about the failure of the Black intellectual.
There's also the love of material culture in an imperialistic and capitalistic sense.
Oh yeah.
It's this idea that separates us from where we came and how we did ascend. So we got a couple questions here. We had a poll on whether or not Black History Month needed to change. How has it already changed through the years? Either one of you all, please feel free. And we got a couple more. Keep them coming, you all. We got a couple more.
Well, I want to talk about that, how it has changed. I think for me,
Yes.
I'm always irritated by the month and how it's celebrated, because it's usually like car and mattress sales, a McDonald's commercial with particular themes and colors, and then there's like a once a year gospel celebration. That's Black History Month. There's some type of endorsement, and there's lots of these diverse photos that we see, and it's not this deep and abiding act of storytelling. Like for myself, of course, I went to school, so I have a bachelor's in English and a minor in African American studies. I have a master of divinity and a concentration in Black church studies, and I'm in a doctoral program now, and I'm focusing on that experience. But you have to have persons who desire this deep knowing, right? So I'm led by this quote. I think it goes, there's no deep knowing of self without a deep knowing of God, and there's no deep knowing of God without a deep knowing of self. So for me to pursue the spiritual realm, this divine presence, meant I had to do this cultural deep dive, and I had to figure out who I was. And it started with a series of questions. I think we don't ask enough questions. That African American History Month has been so capitalized, right? It's just about, it's so far removed from what it's supposed to be. You're supposed to be sitting at the griot's feet and telling these stories of our history, as opposed to watching commercials, right? Securing commercial bits where this company or that company is celebrating Black History Month. That is not what it's supposed to be about. You're supposed to tell the story. We're not doing that. And so that needs to change. But it's big money, it's big business. I think African Americans have fallen prey, to your point, to this capitalist machinery, and that our spirit, our soul, our story is being crushed in the process. And for many people, that's more important. That color green, that dollar bill, is way more important than knowing your story. And persons will turn away from history, deny history and heritage if there's some promise of upward mobility, which often is color-coded white.
The love for material culture. Dr. Lee, how has it changed already through the years?
Well, and I'm going to come at this from a K-12 sense, and that I remember when I was a youngster, which was some years ago, back in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and Black History Month, because I grew up in Flint, Michigan, a predominantly African American school district at the time. Our teachers put some effort, at least the ones I had at Silver Park Elementary and Flint Northern High School. They put effort into making sure that they introduced us to people other than Dr. King and Rosa Parks and the sometimes mentioned Harriet Tubman. We learned some information that went beyond that. But today, since I've been teaching, we have a serious problem when it comes to the celebration of Black History Month in schools. Many times it's a check the box type situation. We need to bring somebody in here that says they're going to represent African Americans and let them do whatever it is they do. There's a very critical quote from Dr. Woodson back in 1926. And every single year for the past 10 years when Black History Month rolls around, I feel and acknowledge what our dear Dr. Woodson said. And he said, do not call in some silver-tongued orator to talk to your school about the history of the Negro. The orator does not generally have much in his head. His chief qualification is strong lungs and good bellows. He knows very little about things in general and practically nothing in particular about the Negro except how to exploit the race. Let the children study the history of the race and they will be the speakers who will put the spellbinder to shame. People, I can't tell you how many times I've sat and watched these silver-tongued orators, who happen, by the way, more often than not, are not African-American. That in of itself is problematic, because here we are once again having somebody else tell us our history from their lens. That's problematic. So Black History Month and the celebration of Black History Month, in my opinion, has been on a downward slide for at least a decade now. And I noticed that somebody in the chat, I believe the individual's name was Eric, mentioned how commercialized Black History Month has become. I was looking at a commercial the other day that was a Target commercial, and how Target is for Black History Month putting out a lot of products by African Americans. Now, when you think about it, you might say, oh, that is great. But their ulterior motive in and of itself, as Dr. Starr just said, and you too, Dr. Dixon, is all about the almighty dollar. And after February, those businesses will fade from Target shelves. They will no longer have that space. The same thing with TV, the streaming services. Oh, here are all the Black movies that you can watch during Black History Month. And after that, you got to go to the search option to find these movies. And many times, like Netflix, they will remove them. So if you ask me, very little progress has been made, positive progress, that is, has been made when it comes to Black History Month.
I think that you make an excellent point about how these things work out through the daily rhythms of, let me say, higher education, because those who control African-American studies and diaspora studies here at the University of Wyoming are not Black. But now we have a Black Studies Center, so now there's competition, but the competition is none, because we do it from a thought that wants to be more inclusive and use esoteric information to create these new actors, accomplishments, allies, heroes and villains. Yeah. And we're not afraid to look at the villain. And then at this point, as we look at it right now, literally, if there would have been some sort of punctified situation or how I would have been created, then we would never have this conversation about the Negro question, because we had many folks who thought we were going too far to even mention the Negro question. Turns to find out they didn't know what the Negro question was, but when we say the Negro question, that automatically put a position of uncomfortability amongst many people. But these are the folks who are above and in control of African-American studies, not only on this campus, but across the country. Mm-hmm. So we got another question I want to go to. One of the comments asked the question, what should Black History Month change into? If it's a transformation, Dr. Lee.
Well, I say we go to what Dr. Woodson originally intended, that we do not just wait until February rolls around to try to instill the knowledge and great history of an African people. This information should be disseminated throughout the year, learned throughout the year, and then during Black History Month, celebrate it. Because that is the time to do what we're doing right now, for us to get together and hold conversations and talk about some of the things that we'll learn, and then take that knowledge and information and apply it to our daily lives so that we can change the system and the society in which we live. That should be the only goal in transforming African-American History Month or Black History Month, is that it should not be a one and done, check the box type situation.
Right. So that leaves Dr. Starr. What should it change into?
So I was thinking that we could use this time to deconstruct.
Okay.
to detach ourselves from the socio-political construct of race, and that we get back to our roots. They have all of these DNA ways in which to discern where we come from. I think it would be important for us to invest in that. And then I'd like to go back. We should take trips. We should go home. We should spend time there, because a part of the problem with African Americans and African people, like that, there's a rub there as well. And that has a lot to do with colonialism. And so I think conversations across those shores would be very beneficial. And conversations like this that question anything that questions our human being and our human belonging. We should be asking questions like, who gave you the right to ask that question? Because that sounds like it's a supervisory, it's a plantation type question, right? Like, I feel like I'm still supposed to give you my papers. You have no right. Who are you really? It's a supremacist question. So I think we need to get into these conversations to start challenging those questions and bringing those questions down a peg or two, because it's coming from a bad place. It's a question that often comes up. It comes up when African-American people are pulled over in their cars or just minding their business in their homes. What are you doing here? And it doesn't matter if the person is a police officer or if they've deputized themselves or if they're members of the same community or if they live in the same building. They're asking people for their papers. Show me your keys. Show me your deed. Prove to me that you live here. I think this is important. I think interrogating the questions that interrogate us and then challenging the basis by which they pose those questions. Who give you the right? What law are you basing that on? And who died and made you supreme? I think we need to start questioning those questions, because you have no right.
Because that comes from a supremacist mindset, which is now becoming par for the course in business as usual. And when we look at how publicly, it's like a public lynching, as you say, what Dr. Khalid El-Akleen calls white absurdity. Let me see if you live in this building.
Yes.
It's absurd, but it's under the idea of racism, which is under the idea of supremacy. Now, as we wrap this up, I want to go to Toby. Don't we have another question? Don't we have another question for our audience? Don't we have another poll question?
We do. I'll pull it up.
All right. And we're going to go to you all for your closing comment, but please jump in on the poll and give your thoughts. See, the problem with this question is there's a space that says neutral. That's the problem with this question. Its ability to say neutral. Okay. I think that about wraps it up. I will ask you all to give us your closing thoughts on the Negro question and how it affects Black History Month, and then we'll wrap it up. Please feel free.
Dear sister, you want to go first?
Sure. So my final thoughts are these: push back, ask questions, and be adamant. Interrogate anything that makes you feel suspicious about your own body. Remember that race is a socio-political construct, that it's a system, it's a caste system that color codes skin, and that is not normal, that your inherent meaning and worth is not embedded in the texture of your hair or the shape of your nose or the color of your eyes, that you were not created to be despised by anyone, that you are made in the imago Dei, if that's what you believe, but that you are never to reduce yourself to the level of being beholden to or sitting at the feet of somebody else's. Don't reduce yourself. You don't struggle. You don't have to struggle to be or to belong. You just simply are. And if you're standing on 2 feet, stand firmly right where you are. And then just study history, study the problems, and study them intentionally, because it's important. It's important to know who you are and why you are and where you are and why you are the way you are right now. Don't accept what has been given to you. And please don't repeat the narrative. Learn your history. Learn your history, and then tell it to someone else.
Dr. Lee?
I think that's a very good point that you've made. And the last statement you made is, when you learn something, you ought to pass that on to somebody else. Because oftentimes people will not take the initiative to do things on their own. And they are more apt to listen to a peer, a friend, a family member than they are a stranger. And my closing thoughts on this, I believe that, concerning this question, is what we really have to look at is that conference was held by individuals who were completely ignorant of the history of the continent in which they went and stole people. Because at the date of that conference, those individuals probably had never stepped foot on African soil. So they did not know the original treasures that were stolen and are quite frankly still stolen to this day from our home continent. But I think that we must fight against those individuals who have this agenda that is being put forth in this nation to continue to whitewash history. And as one of the tenets of critical race theory states, the revisionist history that is being brought forth to our children. Because if we don't stop it there, we are doomed to continue to follow the path in which we're already on. So please, everybody, just do your earnest deed and go out, maybe just pick up a book, maybe 1 book a month. If you're not a reader, 1 every 2 months, but try to gain some knowledge and information about who you are and where you come from. And we're talking about, African Americans, but, we as a nation have a number of other groups of people who live in this country and have forgotten who they are. And so if we're ever going to move forward, we first need to know who we are and then combat this white supremacist culture in which we've been placed.
Well, I agree. And I thank you all for spending your time sharing your information. If there's anything that I can ever do to repay, I'm only a phone call away. I want to end this way, thinking about the Negro question. To have immediate pushback from someone in power is in itself, well, let me say it this way. There's an ayat from the Quran that says a reminder always benefits the believer. And I'm reminded, and I do believe that the Negro question is still as flexible and as much as a part of American vernacular as hot dogs, apple pie, and Chevrolet. And I look at my daily pennings and I look at this wonderful group of scholars that are sitting right in front of me that I'm so glad to be in front of. It's very interesting that we now have this conversation, and those who would push back on just the thought of mentioning the Negro question. Some of these young people that sit in front of me have never heard of the Negro question. These are the people who are going to make the change. So for them to be introduced to it, but it's pay more attention to those who don't want them to be introduced to it. So again, I thank you, my dear cohorts. Sister Star, do not let this be the last time we get together in such a manner. And we thank you so much. And Dr. Lee, business as usual, par for the course, soldier. Thank you so much.
Thank you, brother. I thank you for allowing me to enter this space, brother.
I thank you so much for never saying no, brother. And I thank you too, Star, for coming right along and jumping right in with us. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And everybody say, we out of here.
All right, people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee.
All right, brother.
Let's talk about that Saturday school.
All right, let's do it.
All right. Thank you all, everybody at home. Thank you all.